Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. It's been one of those days. I guess morning if you're on the West Coast, joining us, afternoon if you're on the East Coast. But thank you for being here. My name is James Hansen. I'm the Vice President and Publisher of NextGov, the Federal Technology News and Media Division of Government Executive Media Group. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, Securing the Hybrid Workforce. How to protect your agency, connect your employees. Obviously, we're all aware of the abrupt shift to remote work due to the pandemic. Public and private institutions have been forced to quickly adapt to the new working environment with technologies that enable digital collaboration and productivity while also securing and protecting agency information and offsite devices. 6 months in, it's clear that telework is not just a temporary solution, and for government agencies, continuing to protect information security is paramount to mission delivery. Today, we have a great lineup of speakers to discuss the current state of cybersecurity for the government workforce, what agency leaders have learned since the shift to telework in March, and how technologies can be used to protect government employees in this new hybrid and future new normal environment. So thank you all again. For quick housekeeping items before we get started, at the bottom of the platform, you'll find several icons, including a Q&A tab, which allows you to ask a question. No need to raise your hand. Just feel free to type away. We'll be fielding those questions throughout the program, so submit them as they come to mind. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact us in the chat function and our host, and we'll help you through any challenges. Also, you can always just refresh your browser is usually a winning solution. So let's get started. Joining us today, I'd like to introduce quickly Sean Connolly, Trusted Internet Connections Program Manager at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Walter Makish, Director of Civilian Operations at Cisco. Armando Quintaneves. Armando, apologize if I messed that up, and you please correct me. Director of Security Operations at the General Services Administration. And Wayne Valentine, the Senior Systems Engineer Manager for Cisco's U.S. Public Sector Federal Civilian Operation. And we'll get to know everybody a little bit deeper in terms of their role. And I'd ask all of our panelists to give a little intro in terms of your role, your organization's mission, how you're supporting federal agencies. And I'm going to go ahead, Armando, I'll start with you. How has the pandemic impacted the GSA workforce and security operations?
A little bit about SecOps here at GSA. We're kind of responsible for the overall vulnerability management and the operation of the security across the entire enterprise. We manage the firewalls, we manage the intrusion prevention systems, DNS, the SIM solution, and other various tools and solutions across the enterprise. During this COVID-19, GSA was already telework ready and telework enabled before it happened. So the transition between the two didn't affect our operations at all. So our mission was continued, and it did not impact the civilian sectors or the citizens that we actually provide services to.
No, that's helpful intro and context. Sean, kind of setting a baseline, can you give just a little more intro on the TIC program, your role, and how the pandemic has really accelerated CISA's effort in terms of TIC 3.0?
Sure. Thank you, James. So again, my name is Sean Connolly. I lead the Trusted Internet Connections Program at CISA. TIC comes out of an OMB memo. The most recent one is 1926. It talks about the federal government's strategy for how to protect the perimeter. But in today's environment, what is the perimeter? So with TIC 3, the update, the memo, and we can talk a little about what we've done over the last few years. We've positioned the agencies to be able to support more flexible architectures, be able to use the new strategy that OMB has come out with, and use these alternative architectures, be able to secure their modern environments. To flip the question a little bit, James, I could also talk a little bit about SBA. We've worked with SBA for 2+ years. I think everyone's familiar with Maria Rowe and Guy Cavella and Sanjay, the team over SBA. And if you look at what Maria's team has done when she was there at SBA, how they transition all their workloads from where they were traditionally in the data center into where they are now today. And then look when the pandemic hit, and you look how the reaction through government and the CARES Act and the way that SBA was able to absorb that surge in demand and to serve the citizens like you're asking about in your question. I think that was a great example of the ways in which the agencies are using some of the TIC guidance and able to enable or forward their mission in order to support the public.
Yeah, that's it.
Where Sean, James, if I could jump in here.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely,
I think-
please.
I think Sean could sing his own tune a little more loudly if he wasn't as humble. But I think there's brilliance in TIC 3.0 when you look at what the CISA put together for 3.0. It wasn't an organic evolution of what we saw when we evolved through the earlier versions of TIC, where TIC was a very static thing. So if you look at TIC 3.0, it's a much more flexible framework that really enables agencies to build the platform to enable much more agile infrastructures for these agencies. So the TIC obviously was built around internet connectivity. And when you look at the much more varied use of cloud, software as a service, platform as a service, all those various use cases dictated that you had a much more flexible model that balanced security and connectivity in an appropriate levels. So we're very excited as an industry player to be able to map to that architecture, and we're building out a number of different use cases that over time will create value for federal agencies as they evolve over time to take on more software as a service, more cloud applications, and have security at the same time, because that is probably the biggest shift in access to applications and user interaction that we've seen in quite some time.
No, thank you, Wayne, for adding that context and certainly giving Sean and just a little pat on the back. Sticking with you, Wayne, then, I mean, give the audience just a little sense of your role and background, and then, how has I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but how has the pandemic really impacted federal agencies and the, geographically dispersing employee personnel remotely, and just moving beyond that, internal network that a lot of agencies had secured before this pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, James. So Wayne Valentine, I lead the CISCA team that is aligned to the federal civilian agencies. And so every agency inside of the civilian government, we work with those agencies to help build out solutions where CISCA can create value. Specific to what we observed with our federal agencies, it's much of what's been mentioned before. There was higher demand for remote access. Some agencies were better prepared than others, to be sure. Some, it was a matter of turning up what they had. Some had to go and build out. I think the biggest shift was around the idea of being much more flexible in their approach to enabling connectivity. And so that required a number of different physical things, but also there was a mind shift that had to take place as well, right? One of the, very often we talk about agile IT, and what tends to be overlooked is the agility of the workforce. And so what we certainly observed was a much more agile workforce in terms of IT practitioners had to respond to deliver against the demands that were being made of them. And in some cases, it was 3, 4, 5-fold the number of telework users that they experienced in the past that they had to enable. And so it required all the resources that come together in an environment. They had to be very creative about how you did that. And so some of the processes that they did observe in the past, they might have had to adapt those to respond to the demand. And so I think one of the key behavior trait that we saw was the flexibility of the organizational structure in order to respond to the demand that was created by the pandemic.
Thank you for that, Wayne. Walter, let's switch over to you and just give us kind of a brief intro in terms of your role. And based on what Wayne had just talked about, can you talk maybe operationally of what you saw as well from how Cisco was supporting federal agencies in this massive shift? Certainly, Armando noted GSA was well positioned, but there was a lot of agencies that were not well positioned.
Thanks, Walter Makish, Operations Director for our civilian teams, and it was going back to the original events, right? I mean, in terms of how we interacted with the government and how that may have changed. Simply put, it was whatever was needed at the time that it was needed, and that was to some degree always the mantra, always the case. But in the days that followed the pandemic directly and some of the orders for work from home, it was long days. It was a lot of dynamic thinking and picking up on one of the things that Wayne said. It was that creativity. I think that we had to ensure we were bringing to those virtual tables in terms of solving some very, very different problems than the problems that we thought we'd be solving, a week before, a month before. Those phases have certainly moved forward, and so I think there was never a return to what we knew as normalcy, stating the obvious. That's what everybody knows, but there certainly has been an opportunity for us to take a breath at least, and to say, okay, well, here's where we are. Here's where we expect things to go. Right? Here's where we expect our governments to go, and just like being a trusted partner was something that made us so proud in terms of reacting and combating the pandemic, being that trusted partner as we look forward to a hybrid workforce and what are those things that the government is going to face as we bring people back to work. I think that's the way that we're interacting with the federal government now, and where those kind of trusted partnerships are playing out.
No, that's fantastic, and that is critical to success. Armando, you talked about, obviously, GSA was a largely remote and had a good framework for its telework operations. What are there common characteristics between what was your previous telework framework and it now? Obviously, the pandemic has required scale. Are there characteristics between what that framework looked like before and what it is today?
Not much have changed in that sense, right? It was an increased demand of the VPN infrastructure, which we were already able to handle the added connections that were not normal. The agency has already been anytime, anywhere, any place mentality, and we have already put a lot of infrastructure in place over the last 10 years where you can access a majority of resources not connected to the network, so you don't have to connect. So we always think that you protect the device, you protect the data where it's located, and you protect who's accessing the data if it's a government furnished device. So protect the device and where the data reside, encrypt the data, and allow for multi-factor authentication in place so you can actually validate the users and going into a zero trust framework.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk a little bit further in terms of that zero trust architecture and approach, because it's certainly not only a buzzword. I mean, every agency, I think, is trying trying to move there. Walter, I'll just kind of pivot over back to you for a second. Is, based on what Armando had indicated in terms of data layer security, being able to access that without being connected to a network. Is that a common characteristic that you guys have found as you've been supporting agencies? Are there common characteristics between agencies in terms of successfully transitioning to a remote workforce?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides of it in my mind. There's the security side of it, and then there's the kind of cultural and collaborative side of it. So from a security perspective, it's more about how it is that we layer on that security, understanding that there is going to be a certain amount of risk in everything that we do. That risk isn't necessarily tolerated, but it is accepted that it has to be there, and that we will be looking to layer on security to identify and remediate. On the collaboration side, and on more of like the cultural side, what we've seen is that the characteristics on agencies that have really pushed forward and from our standpoint seem to be in the lead are those agencies that have adopted, obviously technologies like video, but then there are those technologies that extend beyond video for just performance collaboration, things like virtual whiteboards, things like virtual note takers. These are technologies that are inherent in some of these collaboration platforms today, but weren't necessarily turned on, much like video, right? Turning on video was something that it was like, not here today, here tomorrow, right? It was unbelievable. And just a quick anecdote is our CEO before our current CEO. So John Chambers, going back many years, I think it was almost 10 to 15 years, he released a product called Telepresence, right? Some folks in the audience may be shaking their head, remembering that it was a whole host of characters, right, that aren't necessarily the same hosts that are there today in the same space, but it was HP, it was Polycom, it was a different time. And his vision was that this would fundamentally change the way that people did meetings, that people would no longer need to get in person, that they would no longer opt to get on a plane. I think what he never saw coming was that the fact that it would be a pandemic that would actually put us in a position where we could take advantage of the technology and truly see it at work. There is absolutely no substitute for getting in person, and I think that was what maybe he learned, and certainly we learned. But at a time when getting on a plane isn't feasible, at a time when getting in person isn't feasible, those customers that frankly we didn't see embracing video, now not only do they embrace video, we have a competition every time we join as to who can go get the most clever background, so that at least culturally we're continuing to connect and we're continuing to have fun. So that's what I've seen. And I mean, obviously we're going to focus the conversation today on security, but those cultural and collaboration elements of it are certainly a big part of the success we all will have in getting through this.
Yeah, and we will talk about that a little bit further, because I think the cultural piece is important, especially as we go back to some sort of hybrid model in terms of like, what is the balance between the need to accomplish the mission remotely, or the need to be able to be in person? Where's that balance that I think agencies are trying to figure out as much as we are as regular people. Sean, in terms of common characteristics, CISA is working on use cases right now and have already kind of identified and if this is not a relevant question, are there common characteristics between some of those use cases in terms of remote work or hybrid work and how people are connecting to the network?
Sure. So I think what Walter said a few minutes ago about the all hands on deck mantra that happened in mid-April or mid-March there, right? So OMB released a memo 2019, harnessing technology to support mission continuity. We at CISA, we use that as our green flag to start to work with some of the agencies that are having pain points about that shift to remote telework, some of their vendors that they were partnering with. And pretty quickly, we were able to come out with that interim telework guidance. And it's 20 to 30 pages, I think. They give out, like you were just talking about, James, some common elements that the agents should be aware of across some different architectures. And here's the ways for agencies to consider as you start to secure their environments, from data protections, to some of the mobile protections, understanding the data flows themselves and how it may be impacted if agencies still relying on traditional TIC for some of their services. If the agency's allowing the remote users to go to the cloud, they may want to consider these other elements. So I think there's a lot of them that we baked into that interim telework guidance. I key on that word interim because what we're doing in the background is we're building out a draft remote user use case. We want to release that by end of the year. That's why we put the interim telework guidance as just to get us through 2020. We'll release that draft remote user use case. And again, capture some of those common elements and themes they've heard from agencies as we start to begin to support this hybrid model that you talked about.
No, that's great, and that was that initial report that you guys put out in guidance was, I think, really helpful for agencies. Walter, anything to or Wayne, sorry, anything to add there in terms of common characteristics as of agencies and what agencies should be aware that they're not the only one, they're not on an island, that there are other agencies that they can reach into for support for this, that there are some common factors? Anything you want to add there?
Yes, for sure. And it's not just an agency thing. If you look at private enterprise having the same struggles as well. I look internal to Cisco. And so we were a very heavy remote workforce before the pandemic. And so we had probably somewhere around 40,000 plus people that would telework on a regular basis. And we went all remote right around mid-March, and it created a strain on our resources. We had a certain risk profile around traffic that said the traffic had to all be backhauled to some central location. And in the reality of the early days of the pandemic, we could not sustain that architecture, that philosophy. Was just not going to be sustainable. So we had to adapt to the reality of environment. So if you look at the modern architecture for applications and data centers, it's about cloud, it's about software as a service, as I mentioned before. And so we modified and adjusted our risk profile around certain traffic that didn't have to be backhauled to the enterprise, right? And so, that was something maybe 6 months before would have been considered sacrilegious, but as they re-looked at the environment, looked at the traffic and the profile of that traffic and what the risk factor was, because there's always risk associated with it. The risk profile was palatable in order to do what we call split tunneling. So rather than backhauling that traffic, we had direct internet access. DIA is a phrase you hear it get thrown around. And once you do that, you free up a lot of bandwidth, you free up a lot of congestion that you were created inside the enterprise. So it's certainly not something that we see unique to federal agencies. It's all any enterprise of any size or scale. And that concept is still going to extend itself into the remote worker, right? So someone working from home is just a special use case of a remote worker, but whether I'm in a Starbucks or if I'm in an airport, wherever that may be, I have to have a policy, I have to have an architecture that can enable that capability. And the change in probably the biggest shift is to score where the person is, where you are, what device you're using, what's the posture of your device. And so there's all these different elements that come into play that then I might allow you to have certain accesses based on if you're home or if you're maybe in the office. But if you're in an airport, I might downgrade your risk or upgrade or raise your risk profile and adapt the type of information that you maybe get access to. So this is something that as an IT practitioners that we're going to have to build out a design, put a policy in place that reflects that reality. And so I think COVID or the pandemic has accelerated the whole approach to modernizing our infrastructure. And I expect that's something to continue over the next several years, actually. It's going to take that long for most people to build out the appropriate architecture. And it's not going to be a job done. It's going to be a work in progress, to be sure.
Yeah, to kind of add on to that, right? It's, the traditional connection to an enterprise network is going away, like you said, where more and more people are going to be working from home or remotely. And And that's where the zero trust model, similar to where you are, what device are you connecting from, how often have you authenticated, when was the last time you authenticated, what's the posture of those devices, when was the last scan was of those devices. That all takes into effect where you can create a profile into these devices that are connecting to your resources, and then allow that, like you mentioned, split tunnel, and you can narrow it down some more and say, you know what, these sites that I trust, you can split tunnel to, because I have that trust already, but everything else, you still have to go through the conventional method until you allow and open it up more and more. And this is something that we're looking at ourselves at GSA, and continuing that zero trust mentality and pushing more to the edge and utilizing SaaS solution and SASE.
The other thing that I would just add to what Armando's saying right there is that you know, the connection is so extremely important, and kind of how well thought out that is, as you just well stated. You know, the other aspect of it is, what do you do after the fact, right? After that connection is made, the ability to be able to do high level visibility when it comes to your network as well as your applications, is extremely important. And that's where, after that connection is made, after that, you know, after that traffic is flowing, the ability to kind of troubleshoot any issues that you're having, especially those issues you're having on a regular basis, become even more important. There's so much more traffic out there than there used to be. So those tools are not only critical for us to be able to actually continue with a layered approach to security, looking to identify threats and remediate threats, they're also incredibly important to those troubleshooting efforts that I think weren't necessarily at the forefront of folks' mind before the pandemic.
So, Sean, you were one of the authors of the NIST Zero Trust documentation. Does that address some of those things, and how do you think that that's helped agencies in terms of their risk tolerance level, as we're, you know, even going to move back to like a hybrid environment? Have you, in your discussions with other civilian agencies, has this affected their risk tolerance and how they approach like risk management at large?
Yeah, that's a great question, one we're continually having for a while. To focus on the first part of your question there, towards the zero trust and the special pub and the TIC guidance. When we released the TIC guidance, we were obviously tracking, as you mentioned, as one of the authors on this special pub, what was embedded in the NIST special pub, but we were particular not to include all the different elements that were in the NIST special pub into what we call the TIC3 core guidance, because it's very important. And for some agencies we heard from, they still rely on that TIC2 architecture, that's the old traditional castle and moat. And TIC as a program needs the flexibility, or the agencies need that flexibility. So we started to bake in some of those elements from this special pub into the core guidance. The policy enforcement points are there. Of course, you know, in a TIC2 environment, the policy enforcement point was traditionally the TIC itself. Now toward TIC3 and microsegmentation, towards zero trust, those PEPs can be much closer to the data, or much closer to the user. We also, in the NIST special pub, there's that term, the trusted resource, the trusted application. In TIC, we call it the trust zone, with the intent of the old model with TIC, where the agencies usually have a very large trust zone. That castle itself was one large trust zone. Now with TIC3 and microsegmentation, now the agencies can start to work towards shrinking that trust zone, to make it smaller and smaller, a smaller attack surface, smaller radius, if you will, for blast radius. So we've started to introduce some of these terms intentionally, but we've also positioned optimally for there to be a zero trust TIC use case down the road through the OMB memo I mentioned before. The TIC program's on the hook to release a number of use cases. There's the two we've already talked about a little bit, the traditional TIC and the branch office. There's infrastructure, SaaS, PaaS, and a couple more. But then also looking beyond those, we also do want to look at having a zero trust TIC pilot or TIC use case come out of this. And so you mentioned before, James, about the common elements. We want to work with a number of agencies and how they are exploring the zero trust, because there's a lot of different ways to interpret zero trust and how you use it, whether the reliance on ICAM or identity management systems to support that new perimeter. So we want to distill a lot of those lessons learned into that zero trust use case coming down. And to your point on the risk tolerance, I think this is great. And again, TIC needs to be flexible to support those different risk tolerances to go back with TIC 2. Some agencies still are more accepting of the old TIC model because of the risk tolerance they have. Some agencies, I mentioned SBA earlier, they're more forward leaning and some of their risk tolerance is different. So I think these are discussions where we have to have that spectrum of risk and be able to present the program in a way, the framework for the agencies to choose how they want to use the TIC policy going forward.
No, that's fantastic, and it does provide a lot of good direction for agencies. Wayne, I'm going to switch gears a little bit to you, but kind of when you were talking about building risk profiles, part of that is to ensure easy, fast access, really frictionless access for employees. How do you balance that risk tolerance with also in managing risk with also allowing easy and fast access, frictionless access to federal employees?
You have to be very, very good, to be perfectly honest. Because to be sure, secure is the enemy of the connected, right? So if you want to be fully connected, then get rid of all of your security and you be fully connected. The problem is you're going to be probably open to attacks and things that are undesirable. So that becomes much along the lines of what Sean was mentioning, becomes an individual decision, and it literally is an agency and then work group. It gets very granular, and that's why the power of that zero trust is so important to the future, right? Because I can now start to create profiles that are very individualized to each of us, very germane to a user and a use case. And so the only way we're going to do it as IT practitioners is to have a very flexible architecture. Now, the challenge with flexible architectures is that they're not simple; they're very complicated, and the key to overcoming that complexity is to break it down in bite sizes and solve them on a very unit level. One of the overarching capability that we see as an enabler to this is a concept of automation, right? And so we're getting to the point where much like the fighter pilots of the 1970s got to the task saturation flying a fighter jet, the IT practitioner, especially in the arena of security, they're task saturated. When you look at the typical roadmap for all the different areas that I have to be competent to secure my enterprise or secure my agency, it's daunting. And to get that and to get it to work seamlessly and frictionless is non-trivial. So the whole concept of AI ops, right? Artificial intelligence ops, the concept of automation, orchestration, we're really looking towards that. Cisco has built out a developer community around DevNet. And so cisco.developer.com, you can go, and for every platform we have in the marketplace, we have open API development approach to that. The idea being it ought to be, or it has to be extensible, it has to be orchestrated, and it has to be automated, because absent that, having individuals try to meet the dynamic and ever-changing need of each customer and do it effectively and seamlessly is not possible. So we really believe that automation is going to be a key enabling element to providing that type of capability for our agencies and their internal and external customers.
Armando, as a kind of a follow-up to that, how are you guys leveraging automation in terms of allowing easy access, certainly as on the operator side for you, in the security world, lots of operators are, no, I don't want to give, access to anybody, because that, sometimes open up compromises, the network and devices and individual. How do you at GSA kind of, from a frictionless access perspective, how are you managing that? You mentioned two-factor authentication earlier. What are some of the things that you're doing at GSA?
So that's where it comes down to, right? It's the security. Just because you push things to the cloud or you push it to the edge, security is still needs to be available. It still needs to be there for the end users. And that's where achieving the multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, making sure that the data is encrypted in transit, but not only that, also at rest, into the field level. Having role-based access control are some of the things that you could go and add to kind of reduce the attack vectors, right? Having having only username and password to log in, using HTTP instead of HTTPS, having fast ciphers. Those are bad security practices that can, by adding those, you reduce the scope of the attack and also increase the ability for user to access these in a secure manner.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Walter, I don't know if you have anything to add there in terms of, leveraging SOAR, leveraging automated capabilities to allow reliable, easy access. Because honestly, I'm not an IT person. If I can't log into an application when I'm trying to work either remotely or even in the office, it's frustrating. And people on the mission end, they need the access to the data and the applications when and where they need it. Any additional kind of inputs in terms of, again, you kind of work on the operations side that really, makes that as seamless as possible, but also secure?
It goes back to something that I think Wayne said, right, in terms of just that it is what we do from an automation perspective. We just need to ensure is done. We need to work harder to ensure that it's done in a way that is flexible and in a way that our teams and our government teams can continue to operate. It is some of these technologies, as Wayne said, take a lot of planning in order to implement, and that's the key thing. That's where the zero trust framework and the information that's coming out of CISA is so incredibly important. For us, we work directly with CISA based on their guidance to create what was an overlay architecture that you can apply to essentially TIC 3.0, but really extends beyond just what TIC 3.0 is providing from a capability perspective. And I think that overlay just goes to show that it's not about one product, and that's really the key thing for customers to understand. And I have had customers that do believe that there is a product that is an answer to everything. And I will tell you, even if it were a Cisco product, it's not the answer to everything. That approaches need to be layered, and they need to be layered in the context of the guidance that's being provided by CISA through the TIC 3.0, but also through the zero trust framework that's coming out of NIST and the guidance there, continuous monitoring. So all these pieces just need to be put together, and you can see just by how many portions or how many places we're seeking guidance from. We have to be very maniacal about the way that we plan these things out, and we love sitting at the table with our government customers in order to do that. That's what we've seen happen time and time again over the last many months. Add to that SD-WAN and some of the technologies and capabilities that are coming at us from that solution set. It's just incredibly important that we all sit together and come up with that phased approach that's going to work for each individual agency for their specific needs.
Yeah, and I kind of want to, speaking through, the multiple technologies and innovation, just switching gears a little bit. And, for our audience, if there's questions, please keep them coming. I know we got one already. I'm going to come back to it in a second. But as you're looking through, and Walter, will stick with you, as you're looking at technology and technology innovation, as agencies start to move workforce back to the office, how can technology be used to help mitigate health risks?
I'm glad you asked, because it's certainly something that's on the minds of a lot of folks. We've been doing a lot of surveys recently. This won't surprise anybody, but 97% of people out there were worried about coming back to work, right? And felt that the office environment needed to be improved to allow for that. And I believe that's the exact way that the question was phrased. And if there are 3% of office environments out there that don't need any additional work to allow for people to come back to work post-pandemic, I think that's, it's almost equally concerning. But the fact is, for the 97% that said we need to move forward and we need to look at things differently, touching shared devices was, out of those surveyed, that was the number one thing that came back as something that they were concerned about. Next was, where has cleaning actually been done, followed by what conference rooms are over capacity. So if you look at all three of those issues, technology can play a fundamental role in how you do that. First of all, from a touch perspective, there is no reason with the technologies that are available today, many of which are in the hands of our customers already, for anyone to feel the need to touch a device to start a WebEx, to start a video call. That can all be done seamlessly. At the very least, it can be done from a device, your own PC, or your own phone. When it comes to cleaning, conference rooms, things like that, amazingly enough, there are technologies with RTOS and wireless capabilities that can actually track, where people have gone within a building. So you can track what conference rooms have been cleaned, you can track what offices have been cleaned, and you can even track how many people are in various conference rooms. And again, this is all through wireless technology. It's really, really incredible and certainly timely, because this technology preceded the pandemic, but is so useful now. A lot of our customers are going to focus on digital signage when they come back to work. So how are you directing people? First of all, how are you alerting people? How are you getting messages out? Because things can change on a dime, but at the same time, how are you directing people to those places within your conference or your space that have those open environments, that have those open conference rooms, and the places where people are less. So we are experimenting with those technologies and how to utilize those right now, and how many people we can effectively really have in any given workplace. But it is it's very exciting, and it's something that I think can be a real game changer as we try to get back to some of those person-to-person meetings.
Are there any use cases that Cisco is already doing this in the commercial world? I know that, for example, just me going to Home Depot, they have a IoT network that has been built in that tells you how many people are, where people are, and keeping them socially distanced. I would imagine that I know that doesn't fall in the TIC 3.0 world, but I would imagine DHS, who's already has people on site, and that, certainly on the DoD side, are doing rotational scheduling for people. That, yeah, I mean, I think this is a concern, at least for another 6 to 12 months. I'm just kind of curious if, what does it take to architect that? I mean, does an agency in their building, does GSA have to go in and rebuild its infrastructure in order to try and provide some of that
Of course,
security and capability?
Yeah. Sorry, not to get ahead of it. It is, of course, in today's day and age, almost all of this is done through software. So it is something that we can not only make sure that it is available, certainly through enterprise licensing agreements and things like that. A lot of customers already own it. So from a financial impact perspective, it's fairly minimal. But then when you think about implementing technology, anytime you have to implement software versus hardware, it just makes it a lot easier to get that technology out. Now, the reality is, the commercial space, I would definitely have to do some digging, but I'm sure it's out there. As you mentioned, the DoD brethren and the 3-letter agencies that are probably out there listening right now. Those are the folks that are actually in work, but unfortunately, James, we really can't explore some of those use cases as much as we'd like to be able to. But absolutely, this technology is up and running in those environments where, frankly, you can go back to March. Some of those environments we never could take people out of, right? The essential employees, when it comes to the security of our country, are they're not taking any time away. So. Yes, those technologies are in place, but maybe we can do a sidebar in terms of where specifically that's happening.
Yeah, no, I just think it's fascinating, and it's something that all organizations, private, public sector, I think are considering. Sean, how does TIC 3.0 help protect agencies to enable the workforce to continue its mission remotely? I mean, which does often require access to sensitive information, data, and systems. Does it change with a hybrid work environment where half your employees are working from home and half are working in the office? Does that impact the approach or architecture?
I think we're starting to see that shift towards the importance of the identity management side, right? And we've heard for a number of years, identity management's the new perimeter, and our identity is becoming the network now. And so that shift towards the release, if you will, the traditional perimeter. One thing that we're seeing, I'll just walk outside and take my TIC hat off for a second, is when agencies are starting to explore the zero trust environment, these architectures, I think us all here being architects, we can understand what we're trying to do, and the developers can understand. We're starting to hear from some agencies the challenges they have in terms of some of their like authority operate security packages they have to create, in terms of a lot of those ATOs for years were built out off of the expectation that the system owners own the network, the system owners own the devices, right? And especially in zero trust, it's much more ephemeral now. It's not as much about, in fact, I think one of the tenets of zero trust is the network is suspect. So it's hard to couple the traditional ATO concerns, if you will, and bolt them over around what zero trust is trying to be. So I think with what Ron Ross has done with NIST, of course, and the release of Rev 5, the 153 controls, I think you're going to start to see this discussion going forward. And again, outside the scope of TIC, but just how do we start to embrace these architectures more from the security role, the traditional risk management side of the house? And so it's encouraging in terms of timing some of the release of these documents going forward. But it's going to be interesting to see how we couple the expectations around trust, what it meant to the security auditors and stuff, and what trust means to us in this new environment going forward.
Yeah, Armando, do you have kind of any thoughts there? I mean, again, given that GSA has had a robust telework presence, and because of that, I'm sure also has a hybrid environment. But what are there new technical challenges or considerations of a hybrid workforce? Are there new security challenges or considerations when you have half the people in and half the people out versus having everybody out or everybody in?
So it really comes down to making sure that management and supervisors have that flexibility, right? And making sure that they could go and provide the ability to limit the amount of time that an individual has to go into the office. And at the same time is having the ability to track how many people are in the building and where they're located and situated. So at GSA, a lot of the spaces are open. There's no cubicles like other locations where everything is kind of close and everyone is kind of in small little offices. So a lot of it's open space, open environment where you can situate individuals and close out certain areas so you can create that distance. We already had in place the ability to go and know when a conference room is being booked and for how long it was, and have that, and just adding that additional functionality of saying when was the last time it was cleaned will help with that. It really comes down to in providing that communication down to the end user, to everyone understand this is what's available to them and how they can go and validate that this is, where they're sitting at, when was the last time it was cleaned, or where your other. Another thing about it is you don't have to use a conference room. We have the ability to meet remotely through video chat. We have the ability to use virtual whiteboard. So that traditional method of actually having to be in one room altogether is going away, and now it's going to be more of everybody turn on your cameras, let's get together virtually and go and hash out through a whiteboard session. So the technology is already there where we don't have to bump shoulders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're kind of proving it. But some agencies do have to come together at some point in certain environments, right? Wayne, how do agencies, based on Armando gave some great examples, Walter gave some great examples, how do agencies maintain communications, connectivity, and culture in a hybrid environment, and how important is that communication to ensure that you are safe and that you are secure and that you can operate the mission from anywhere you are?
Yes, and that's an evolving reality for most customers. And again, not just a federal thing. It's just about any entity in the workforce is struggling with this, because part of how we refreshed our culture is being able to meet on a regular basis, person to person, and now that becomes a challenge, right? And so I think the companies that are going to be successful is the ones that build the same mechanisms in this environment, right? You have to be intentional about how you interact with your workforce in terms that reflect the reality of what we're dealing with today. So you have to go out and put together, whether it's different ways that will force everyone to come together on a weekly, monthly, whatever is an appropriate period of time that works for your organization. You have to be intentional about that, because that's one of the ways you refresh your culture, is to get that connection and build that connection in different ways. So I think you have to get creative about how you make that work, and so you do have tools to help that, certainly, as Walter touched on, the collaboration platform. And then we have to look external to companies that maybe do spend time working in a virtual fashion over that have developed expertise in those areas. So find individuals or find organizations that can help you be creative in your environment, right? People who have done it before, or who for the most part have worked that way to be effective. One of the things that I think is interesting is that when you go to a remote work model, it actually opens up your organization to a broader spectrum of workers, if you will. So, it's true of the federal government, it's true of private enterprise. We're struggling to find talent. And so once you go to remote work, once you're very flexible in your work modality, you now create an opportunity to open up the tent a little wider. So people who before, when you were locked into a physical building in a city, and now they could be 100 miles from that office, but still be part of that work team. Maybe they come into the office once a week, maybe they come in once or twice a week. Well, whatever that may be, you find a way to pull those people in, and now you have a much wider tent, because we're all struggling to find talent. Talent is probably the hardest capital to come by, and the human capital is the hardest capital to come by. And so I think that's the opportunity you come to discover in this new way of working, this new modality of work, is that there might be a shining silver lining at some point. So those are some of the ways I think you can energize your workforce, by taking something that's a negative and making it a positive.
There are absolutely silver linings. I mean, it's also when you look at the people that you can get into a meeting. I mean, our calendars, I don't know about everybody else, but sometimes it's like I got back-to-back 30-minute calls all day, right? And that's just not that that's the best way to work, but that is not a something that could be accomplished if you were having to walk from conference room to a conference room. So there's absolutely silver linings. The other recommendation that I would give, and what I see customers doing, is that there should be a common baseline for the tool sets that everybody on your team has at their at their disposal, whether at the office or at home. That same survey I was mentioning earlier, 2/3 of people actually prefer a video device that isn't their laptop, right? And so I had a customer who happens to be a neighbor of mine who said, "Hey, do you mind coming over and getting me set up in my home office the way that I was set up in the actual office?" And it was great because this person wasn't necessarily a lean forward type of person. Now that we've put those tools in his hand, they're going to have to pry him out, right? I mean, you can really get used to using some of these tools, and some of the software, some of the devices. All of these things can really level up the ability for agencies not only to, again, continue to be productive through this pandemic, but realize those silver linings, as Wayne mentioned.
I think that's an excellent point, because I think a lot of individuals have experienced the challenge of learning those tools, and I guess it just kind of randomly to Armando and Sean. I mean, did your agencies give you kind of tutorials on how to use? I mean, you guys are pretty tech savvy, but there's a lot of case managers at various agencies that aren't very tech savvy, that probably fumble through some of these tools when they could really probably accelerate their output with a little bit of training. I'm just kind of curious.
And yes, so we have provided those type of training where we've done little videos for them to be able to go and figure out how to utilize the solution, the collaboration tools. We do a lot of comms through emails, and also through our web portal to kind of say this is and these other trainings that you can go and attend. In addition to that, we also provide different types of live session and a way to go and connect with IT support and get whatever additional support they need. We always have that strong communication back and forth between the end users and and find out what issues they're having and try to address those before it escalates across the entire enterprise.
Yeah, I could flip the training a little bit in terms of how CISA is helping the agencies understand some of what the adversaries techniques are going on right now toward those that are taking advantage of the remote workforce. So for 10 years ago, when it's a traditional castle and moat, the adversaries more scanning something like a bind DNS or SendMail, looking for a vulnerability in that. You don't hear that as much now. Now it's adversaries spinning up like a fake social networking profile and trying to gain trust to a user through that social profile. Maybe the adversaries sending some type of text through some type of social messaging app, or the adversaries scanning, the cloud services themselves. Recently, FBI and CISA, we released the advisory. To be fair, there's one advisory I'm talking about in August. This was released more on the commercial side because PIV cards, CAT cards can mitigate this some. But the advisory is about vishing. It's V for voice for vishing, where you saw where adversaries were spinning up fake login profiles. And then adversaries were calling users up and then asking those remote users to log into that remote website. And then the adversaries gaining their credentials, the two-factor authentication or the one-time password. Then the adversary was using that to get into the environment of that organization. Again, this is more on the commercial side. I don't want to say there's an agency side, but it's just that advisories going out to the agencies and to the greater community about what the adversary is doing differently now in this environment. So it's another way I think we're trying to help with the training aspect.
And Sean, I think that's a great point. One of the things that I'd highly recommend, we do it internal at Cisco, where we do active sending fake phishing emails and seeing how many people respond to it. And you'd be surprised how many people you wouldn't think they would, but they respond to the email. And what it does, it trains your sensibilities, because ultimately the human element sometimes is the most vulnerable. You can put the best security architecture in place and all the technology and all the automation,
Right.
but the human element is the weakest link. And so I think we have to condition your users to understand what things are easy. Yes, I do that. No, I'm not sure. And to get very of a critical eye to what could be a source of attack. And so just like everything that we do, you have to train people for the behavior design. And I think what you're talking about, Sean, is a great point, because it's going to become the ultimate source for vulnerabilities in our agencies or in the enterprise.
Yeah, I think the training and upskilling and really showing employees the value of some of these tools, but also doing them securely and practicing good cyber hygiene is critical. I know we didn't get to all the questions. We did get one, so I'll put it. I mean, there's a number of questions, but I will ask the group this one from our audience. Should agencies consider pushing out the perimeter of the network, much like the Air Force is doing? The need for more secure remote working method presents an opportunity to use clusters of federal employees and develop federal enterprise centers. Anybody have any thoughts? Certainly, I'm sure Wayne and Walter do in terms of pushing out the perimeter of the network. I'm not as familiar with what the Air Force is doing there, but does that question make sense to any one of you? Want to answer that for our audience member?
What I'd recommend, and what I assume it to mean the idea that the network is rather than having it shrunk down to the enterprise, it's opened up to a much broader set of users and user locations, I guess, is what it's getting. And it is the concept of TIC-3O or CISA or SASE, if you have heard that phrase used about I think in the federal realm, we talk about TIC-3O. It really translates to what Gartner coined as SASE, and so that concept is very valid, and it's the way you extend your perimeter, if I'm interpreting the question correctly. But you extend it, but you still provide security for your users and your applications and your data. The one thing I'd highly recommend is that you align to your vendors, your trusted vendors who are practitioners in these areas, and find someone in a consulting role that you have gone out and validated can bring value to you, because this is non-trivial, to be sure, and it's something that every agency, every enterprise ought to have an approach, or they have to take a position on this. You won't be able to sit on the sidelines. You have to get in the game and figure out what is the appropriate level of extension for my enterprise, for my agency. And so there's no embarrassment in getting help, because this is very, very complicated arena to be sure, and it's evolving, and it's going to continue to evolve. And there are many products and capabilities that are required to make it effective, make it in fact provide the level of security that you need once you extend it out. But certainly, I think every entity will, Sean touched on it. Some will still stick to a TIC-2O, TIC 2.2 model, because that fits their mode of operation, their philosophy, if you will. But for many, it's going to put it to their benefit to extend that perimeter out to accommodate a much more flexible workforce.
Yeah, and just to add to it, just in terms of what I know about the solution, right? Air Force leaned really heavily into zero trust and building a zero trust framework. And so if that perimeter is going to be extended, which is a reasonable way to go about things, it's all about the identity at that point, right? And those rules that ensure that whoever it is that is on that network at any given time, you know exactly who they are and what they're accessing, and they can only access what you want to allow for. And so I think that was where Air Force really focused their efforts, was on that identity portion and of zero trust framework.
Awesome. No, that's I think that certainly answered the question. The other question we got, Walter, was to you, and can you share those survey results that you were talking about?
I saw that, and we certainly can.
Okay,
It
awesome.
was a great survey. I was glad that we did it because I think it was very informative. So absolutely, we'll do.
That's fantastic. Well, we're out of time, and I want to be conscious of everybody's schedule, given that everybody's on back-to-back meetings. But Armando, I want to thank you. Sean, thank you very much, and certainly Walter and Wayne, thank you for sharing your insights on securing the hybrid workforce. It's something that we'll continue to discuss over the next year and into the future. So really appreciate your time and insights for our audience. And as a reminder to our audience, this digital event's been recorded, and you'll be receiving the recording and other helpful links like the survey via email post-event. And we strongly encourage you to pass these items along to our colleagues. This is a journey, and we're all in this together. So really appreciate it, and thank you for tuning in.
Good to be with you. Thank you.